Welcome friends to the next segment where we talk about arms control and disarmament. We in this segment will talk about first about the different agreements which have been concluded at the international level relating to arms control and disarmament. Since the use of the atomic bomb by the Americans in Japan in 1945, countries of the world have been making efforts to see that the arms race which was there between America and the Soviet Union is rather the pace of that arms race is reduced to some extent. But as we have already discussed in the previous segment, that because of the suspicion and the mistrust which was there on both sides between the two major powers of the world, all disarmament efforts, appeared to be falling by the wayside. But as we come to the 1960s, we see that slowly and gradually something concrete started happening, although it was not to the real expectations, or to the level of the expectations which other countries of the world were having from these superpowers, but at least something concrete started happening. And it started with the Antarctica Treaty, which was the first disarmament treaty to come into force in the year 1961. It was signed by 26 states in 1959. And the treaty, actually banned military use of Antarctica. And it is specifically prohibited nuclear tests being conducted there. And it also prohibited the disposal of nuclear waste or creating of some kind of storage facilities in Antarctica. Now, the basic reason was that Antarctica was a relatively unexplored area in terms of, nuclear waste or disposal of nuclear waste. And the possibility was that countries which had nuclear technology at that particular point of time would go and use, that place which was where basically no human habitation was there, for conducting their nuclear tests and then pollute the Antarctica and then also use it for their waste disposal or creating storage facilities. So to preempt that, this treaty was signed by 26 states and it came into force in 1961. Then after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the first major breakthrough in arms control efforts of countries was achieved in 1963 when the United Kingdom, USA and USSR signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. It was a treaty which banned nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. Now, this treaty, although apparently it is a very important step in the field of arms control, and it's ensuring that such kind of tests, do not happen in the atmosphere, outer space and underwater. But countries which were not having nuclear weapons, they took it as a means to ensure that the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons does not take place. Because as we all know that for making nuclear weapons, you need to conduct tests. And a country which is starting to build nuclear weapons, would necessarily be required to conduct a test either in the atmosphere or in the outer space or underwater. Without it, you would not be able to test whether what you have done is actually working. So this treaty which was signed between these three major powers of the world was apparently an arms control measure, but some people saw that there is some kind of a fly in the ointment because it is something, which is intended at preventing other countries from going and joining their ranks as nuclear weapon states because they banned these kinds of tests. Nevertheless, if we count it only on face value, this was an important step in the direction of arms control. Then the Outer Space Treaty was signed in the year 1967 by 83 countries, officially known as the 1967 Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So this was also an important treaty to ensure that this kind of a competition does not reach to the outer space. Another important treaty in South America, which was signed in the year 1967 by 22 states there, is known as the Tlatelolco Treaty, which was intended at making South America a nuclear weapon free zone, which actually banned testing, possession, deployment of nuclear weapons, and also put in all kinds of safeguards on nuclear facilities if some country in South America was intending to make use of atomic energy for peaceful purposes, for generating electricity or other important medicinal purposes. They had to follow certain very strict safeguards. So actually this was a very important step, because here certain countries which are not having nuclear weapon states, probably they were not even in a race to have nuclear weapons, but they are trying to ensure that in future their area is not infested with that kind of a nuclear weapons competition. So to preempt that, these countries of the Latin American region decided to sign this treaty to ensure that Latin America continues to be a nuclear weapon free zone. Then the very famous and important treaty, which is known as the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was opened for signature in 1968, which obligated the 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states, the US, the USSR, the USSR, UK, France and China, not to transfer nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or their technology to any non-nuclear weapon state. And it said that non-nuclear weapon state parties who signed this treaty would undertake not to acquire or produce nuclear weapons or nuclear explosives, which are rather covered under this particular treaty. So it was one of the most widely accepted arms control agreement, or a nuclear arms control agreement. And by the year 2000, there were 187 states which had become parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Only a handful of states, like India and Pakistan, remained non-members of the NPT. North Korea, which had earlier signed the treaty, decided to withdraw in the year 2003. Now, here again, I would like to talk about that issue of horizontal proliferation. Now, that I discussed in relation to the 1963 partial nuclear test treaty. But here, it is very explicitly stated in this treaty that nuclear weapon state will ensure that nuclear material or nuclear weapons are not transferred to non-nuclear weapon states. Now, it is very clearly creating 2 categories of countries. One category of countries, the 5 nuclear weapon haves. The assumption in this treaty is that they are very responsible countries, so they can have nuclear weapons because they would never misuse them. Although America very blatantly misused the same weapon in 1945. And they are saying that this should not flow on to other countries. So the technology or the weapon should not transfer to other countries, means that you are trying to create another category of countries which are non-nuclear weapon states, and they are being branded as irresponsible countries, and that's why they cannot be trusted with the nuclear weapon. So therefore, all efforts should be made to ensure that the technology does not flow to them. So that was the argument of India and Pakistan, that this treaty is so very discriminatory. It is treating some countries as responsible and they can have their nuclear weapons, and it is not talking about them giving away their nuclear weapon option. And other countries are being restricted in every possible way that they would not rather have this nuclear weapon, and the nuclear weapon states are asked not to transfer technology to them, and they are also asked not to acquire or produce nuclear weapons. So, because of this openly discriminatory nature of the treaty, India refused to sign this treaty. Then comes the Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems, which is known as the ABM Treaty of 1972. It was a treaty which is between 2 countries, which is known as a bilateral treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was signed in May 1972. Now, the Ballistic Missile Treaty is very important because it talks about a limitation on anti-ballistic missile systems. And as we know that by this time, in the early 70s, the missile technology had increased significantly in terms of its accuracy and in terms of of the distance, which missiles could cover. So the limitation on this missile system was something very important, and that led these two countries to decide that they had to conclude a treaty, which later on became very controversial, and finally America withdrew from this treaty. Then comes the SALT I treaty. It was the first series of strategic arms limitation talks, which extended from 1969 to 1972 between America and the Soviet Union. It was mainly a quantitative arms control agreement. It basically limited the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers on each side, and also limited the SLBM launchers and modern ballistic submarines. So it was some kind of a quantitative arms control agreement which both these countries agreed to execute. Then after a few years, the SALT II negotiations also started. And here the basic target was to replace the agreement, which was an interim agreement which was reached between America and the Soviet Union, to turn it into a long-term comprehensive treaty. And the basic item here was a strategic offensive weapon systems. So some kind of a limitation was to be agreed upon relating to the strategic offensive nuclear weapon systems between America and the Soviet Union. Then in the year 1988, the Americans and the Soviets entered into the INF treaty. It eliminated all nuclear-armed ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 to 5,500 kilometers. And all their infrastructure had to be dismantled by both these countries. It was the first nuclear arms control agreement to actually target reduction of nuclear weapons. And it did not only talk about establishing ceilings. Earlier, the talks were in relation to putting some kind of a ceiling, some kind of a moratorium on the number of weapons which either parties could have, so that some kind of a confidence could be built between the countries. But here it was actually intended at reducing nuclear weapons, although of a certain category. The counter argument here was that other countries, or many scholars, argued that since these countries had by that time built so many kinds of ballistic and cruise missiles which were much more than their requirement. So those missiles and those systems were enough to annihilate the whole humanity many times over. So they were not required actually, because the kind of firepower both these parties required in this category, they already had. So therefore they were trying to destroy the excess nuclear weapons which they had. And that is why they had decided to conclude this treaty. But of course, you could have arguments on both sides, because you cannot always, sense some kind of a conspiracy in what the big powers were doing, because that again was a consequence of distrust, which always is all pervasive in the international system. So whether you are a major power, you have some different kind of distrust, but smaller countries also have distrust when they are looking at the actions of the bigger powers, that there is some kind of a conspiracy in whatever they are doing, even if they might be actually trying to sincerely reduce some kind of or some category of weapons. Then the negotiations started on the START treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1982. Here the United States was seeking a treaty that would provide for deep reductions in the strategic offensive nuclear forces of America and the Soviet Union, and to put equal limits on the two sides. And it also talked about creating some kind of effective verification procedures, which we discussed earlier, because the basic problem in all disarmament and arms control talks was that how could they effectively verify what the other party was doing, given the kind of technologies they had and given the kind of capacity they had to conceal their systems and to cheat whatever kind of verification systems you had. The talks in this regard were suspended in 1983 when the Soviet Union walked out in protest over the US deployment of intermediate range missile systems in Europe. But later on, some mediation was done and then the talks resumed in 1985 and they were eventually concluded in the year 1991. So this Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty called for reducing the superpowers' strategic arsenal by about 30 to 35%. Then the START-2 treaty is the most recent product of the bilateral arms control efforts between the United States and the Russian Federation. Here, the President of America, George Bush, and Boris Yeltsin signed this treaty in the year 1993 after the collapse of the Soviet Union during a meeting in Moscow. And here both the parties agreed on complete elimination of all land-based ICBMs, that is intercontinental ballistic missiles with MIRVs. And by December 2003, they agreed that each side would deploy no more than 3,000 to 3,500 strategic nuclear warheads. So therefore, there was an agreement, that they would eliminate land-based ICBMs and then they would only be deploying a certain number of strategic nuclear warheads, which both sides agreed to do. And the basic reason here was that the Cold War arms race had come to an end because of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And the kind of fears which these two countries were nursing earlier were assuaged and reduced to a significant extent. Then the UN General Assembly, adopted the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in September 1996. This treaty prohibited any nuclear explosion, whether for weapons or for even peaceful purposes. And this treaty, while banning both full-scale and low-yield nuclear tests, including hydronuclear tests, would not curtail subcritical experiments, which would only involve chemical rather than nuclear explosions. Here again, the argument which came from the other side was that since the big nuclear weapon states had already concluded all their nuclear explosions in space and underwater and on the surface, and they were now only involved in subcritical experiments, and those experiments did not require to go outside, at the external level, and they did not want the other countries of the world to have any kind of nuclear explosions for making nuclear weapons or for peaceful purposes, which might be a camouflage of some kind, of the actual weapon programs which they are feared to be going forward with. So that is the reason why the big powers, especially America, wanted that this kind of a treaty should be concluded. And this was also some kind of an indirect measure to ensure that horizontal proliferation is arrested to a great extent. Nevertheless, this was an important treaty which was concluded in the year 1996. Then the next thing which we need to talk about is what is the actual need of nuclear disarmament, or rather disarmament in general. Now, if one were to only talk about nuclear weapons, they actually have made the issue of disarmament very, very important at the international level, because nuclear weapons are weapons of mass overkill. They would destroy everything in the world. And therefore, when the nuclear weapons came on the scene, the threat of weapons, increased manifold. And therefore, disarmament became a very important subject for discussion everywhere in the world because of the kind of threat, which came forward as compared to the threat which countries have in relation to conventional weapons. This was a much greater, much graver threat, and that's the reason why the need for disarmament increased. Then there is a very important economic argument in favor of disarmament, because the very important argument, which is that funds allocated for military purposes, by the nations, they are an indication that you are not going to spend money in other avenues, other very important areas which people need. So, therefore, it means that if a lot of resources are earmarked for the military, that means other areas are being ignored. And that is not only in relation to countries which are relatively poorer, but even rich countries, Apparently, rich countries, would spend a lot of money on their weapons. So, therefore, disarmament is something very good because it reduces the burden of military expenditure on that country and rather directs the resources to the developmental needs of the people. And the argument is that if development happens in countries are economically well off, they are on their own rather in terms of meeting the requirements of the people, the possibility of the war, or of conflicts in countries reduces. The other is the social argument. The economic case for disarmament is closely related with the social case because the military expenditure also has profound social consequences. Problems of poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, and that of the rising standards of living is not only confined to developing countries. These problems to a significant extent are present also in rich countries. So military expenditure absorbs resources which could be otherwise put to use for social services. So therefore, the emphasis on building the social infrastructure in countries can be rather increased if funds are rather diverted from military expenditure to the social requirements in countries. Then of course, the political need is that armaments would cause more suspicion and fears, and they would poison relations between and among countries. So political differences become sharpened by the fear and suspicion which the amassing of weapons in countries, especially those who are not generally historically on good terms, generates. So the amassing of weaponry also increases the possibility that force or violence might be used as a means of dealing with international issues and conflicts. So if more and more weapons are present with countries or in the possession of countries, the possibility of conflict would obviously increase. Next, we need to talk about finally about the obstacles, which are there in the path of disarmament. Number one, a major hindrance in the path of disarmament is the fear and distrust which countries nurse against each other. As a result, every country views with suspicion the disarmament proposals put forward by the others, especially if that country is required to do something, to concede something, to reduce or put some kind of a limitation on its weapon systems. So that is the point, when the countries start hesitating and they are suspicious. And that is the biggest obstacle in the path of any worthwhile, genuine effort towards disarmament or arms control. This problem is also closely related to the problem of security. There has been a strong consciousness of an inverse relationship between disarmament and security. So, there is a very strong feeling that there is some kind of inverse proportionality. So, as you disarm, your insecurity is going to increase proportionately. Similarly, as you arm yourself more and more, security increases. So this kind of inverse proportionality thinking, mindset is another major hindrance in the path of countries deciding or agreeing to any kind of disarmament or arms control. Then finally, no nation expresses itself against disarmament as such because it is politically incorrect to oppose any proposal of disarmament or arms control. But the countries view any disarmament plan from the point of view of their national interest. So on the one hand, you don't criticize it. You can't talk against it because you would be seen as a country or singled out as a country which does not want peace and security in the world. But on the other hand, when you actually look at disarmament in terms of operationalizing it, you're always looking at it from the lens of your national interest defined by your own country. During disarmament negotiations, such conditions are placed by countries, which are impossible for other countries to digest. Again, here you can expand the joker theory given by Joseph Nogi, who gave it in relation to only the big superpowers, but even other countries, when they are talking about it, they would want to put such impossible constraints and conditions on a rival and other countries that is difficult to accept by the other country or countries, and then eventually the negotiations or the proposals would not come to fruition. So these are the major obstacles in the path of disarmament and arms control. But generally, we all understand and agree that even if disarmament or arms control would not actually go and stop a war or reduce the number of wars, but at least, they are positive steps towards reducing conflict and tension and the causes of conflict and violence at the international system. And therefore, it is commonly understood that these two are worthwhile objectives to at least aspire for by countries of the world and the international community. Thank you.